I still remember the exact moment I realized I was in love with the wrong man. Not wrong because he was cruel or because he didn't care, but wrong because he was my stepfather. I was 17 when it started, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while he made coffee, and he brushed past me in a way that felt different. His hand grazed my shoulder, lingered for half a second too long, and something in my chest cracked open. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that good girls don't feel heat crawl up their necks when their mother's husband walks into a room. But the truth is, I wasn't imagining it. He felt it too. And for 2 years, we pretended we didn't, until the night everything shattered and I learned that love isn't always pure, and desire doesn't care about right or wrong. What happened between us destroyed my family, ruined my relationship with my mother, and left me wondering if I was the victim or the villain. I still don't know the answer. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you're alone. Because this isn't a story with a happy ending. My mom met David when I was 15. She'd been single for 3 years after my dad left us for a woman he met at a conference in Seattle, and I think she was just tired of being alone. David was different from my dad in every way that mattered to her. He was stable, present, interested in our lives. He had kind eyes and a steady job as an architect, and he didn't flinch when my mom told him she had a teenage daughter with anxiety and a habit of shutting people out. I remember the first time he came to dinner at our house. He brought flowers for my mom and a book for me, some young adult fantasy novel he said his niece loved. I barely looked at him, gave him a cold thank you, and spent the whole meal pushing pasta around my plate. But he didn't try too hard. He didn't force conversation or pretend to be my dad. He just existed in our space, calm and unbothered, and somehow that made it easier. They got married 10 months later in a small ceremony at a vineyard upstate. I wore a pale blue dress my mom picked out, stood beside her while she cried happy tears, and watched David slip a ring on her finger with a smile so genuine it almost made me believe in love again. I was 16 by then, and I'd started to like him. Not in any way that felt dangerous, just in the way you like someone who's good to the people you care about. He fixed things around the house without being asked, made my mom laugh in a way my dad never did. And every now and then, he'd knock on my bedroom door and ask if I wanted to watch a movie or help him cook dinner. I always said no at first, but he'd wait, leaning against the doorframe with his hands in his pockets, and eventually I'd give in. We'd watch old action films or cook elaborate meals that never turned out right. And he'd tell me stories about his own teenage years, about how he used to be shy and weird and convinced no one would ever understand him. It felt easy, safe, but then I turned 17 and something shifted. I don't know if it was me or him or both of us, but suddenly the air between us felt thicker, charged with something I didn't have a name for. I started noticing things I shouldn't have noticed. The way his voice dropped when he said my name. The way his eyes followed me when I walked across the room. The way he stood just a little too close when we were alone in the kitchen, his arm brushing mine as he reached for a mug, his breath warm on my neck. I told myself I was being crazy, that I was reading into things because I was a teenager with too much time, and too many emotions. But then one night, my mom was out with friends and David, and I were watching a movie on the couch. I don't even remember what we were watching, some thriller with a convoluted plot, but I remember the weight of his presence beside me, the way I could feel the heat radiating from his body, even though we weren't touching. And then, halfway through the movie, he stretched his arm across the back of the couch, not quite around my shoulders, but close enough that I could feel the intention behind it. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat frozen while my brain screamed at me to get up, to go to my room, to do anything but stay there. But I didn't move, and neither did he. We sat like that for the rest of the movie, the tension so thick I thought I might suffocate. And when the credits rolled, he stood up quickly, muttered something about needing to check his emails, and disappeared into his office. I went to my room and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my chest tight, my mind racing. I knew what I'd felt, and I knew somehow that he'd felt it too. That was the night everything changed. That was the night I stopped being able to lie to myself. After that, it was like we were both walking on a tightrope, trying desperately not to fall, but knowing we would eventually. The touches became more frequent, more deliberate. His hand on the small of my back when he passed me in the hallway. His fingers brushing mine when he handed me a plate at dinner. The way he'd look at me sometimes, his gaze heavy and unreadable, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't want to solve. I started avoiding him, spending more time in my room, making excuses not to be alone with him. But it didn't help. If anything, it made it worse, because the avoidance itself felt like an admission, like we both knew what we were trying not to acknowledge. My mom didn't notice, or maybe she did and chose not to see it. She was happy, happier than I'd seen her in years, and I couldn't bring myself to shatter that. So I kept quiet. I swallowed the guilt and the confusion and the terrible, aching want that had started growing in my chest. And I pretended everything was fine. The first time he touched me in a way that couldn't be explained away, I was 18. It was late summer, a few weeks before I was supposed to leave for college, and my mom had gone to visit her sister for the weekend. David and I were alone in the house, and I'd spent most of the day in my room packing boxes and trying not to think about how much I wanted to stay. Not because I loved our house or my hometown, but because leaving meant being away from him, and that thought made my chest ache in a way I didn't want to examine. That evening, I went downstairs to make dinner and found him in the kitchen, already cooking. He'd made pasta, my favorite, and he smiled when he saw me. That soft, careful smile that always made me feel like I was the only person in the world. We ate together in near silence, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. And afterward, we cleaned up side by side, our movements synchronized in a way that felt too intimate. When we finished, he turned to me, his expression serious, and said, "I'm going to miss you when you leave." His voice was low, rough around the edges, and the way he was looking at me made my breath catch. I opened my mouth to respond, to say something light and dismissive, but before I could, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered against my cheek, and for a moment we just stood there, frozen, the air between us crackling with all the things we'd been refusing to say. And then he leaned in, just slightly, his eyes searching mine. And I knew that if I didn't move, if I didn't step back and break whatever spell we were under, something irreversible was about to happen. But I didn't move. I didn't want to. And when his lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative and wrong in every possible way, I kissed him back. It lasted only a few seconds before he pulled away, his eyes wide with shock and something that looked like horror. He stepped back, his hands shaking, and said, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. That should never have happened." His voice was strangled, desperate, and I could see the panic rising in his face. But I wasn't panicking. I wasn't horrified. I was standing there with my heart racing and my lips tingling, and a terrible sense of rightness settling over me. And that scared me more than anything. I didn't say anything. I just turned and walked upstairs to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to process what had just happened. He'd kissed me. My stepfather had kissed me, and I'd kissed him back. And the worst part, the part that made me feel sick and exhilarated all at once, was that I wanted him to do it again. The next morning, I woke up expecting everything to feel different, heavier, like the air itself had changed. But when I went downstairs, David was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper like nothing had happened. He glanced up when I walked in, his expression carefully neutral, and said good morning in a voice that was just a little too casual. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him, my hands wrapped around the mug, and we existed in this strange, suffocating silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, he set down the paper and looked at me directly, his jaw tight. "We need to talk about last night," he said. His voice was steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table. I nodded, my throat dry, and waited for him to continue. He took a breath and said, "What I did was completely inappropriate. You're my stepdaughter, and I crossed a line that should never be crossed. It won't happen again." His words were firm, definitive, the kind of words that should have made me feel relieved. But instead, I felt something twist in my chest, something sharp and painful. I wanted to agree with him, to say, "Yes, you're right. We should forget this ever happened." But the truth was sitting heavy on my tongue, and before I could stop myself, I said, "What if I don't want to forget it?" The words hung in the air between us, and I watched his face go pale. He stared at me like I just said something in a language he didn't understand, and then he shook his head slowly. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, his voice rough. "You're 18, you're about to start your life, and I'm married to your mother. This can't happen." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked out of the kitchen before I could respond. I sat there alone, my coffee growing cold in my hands, feeling like I'd just jumped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. For the next week, we barely spoke. He avoided me as much as possible, leaving for work early and coming home late. And when we were in the same room, he wouldn't look at me. My mom came home from her sister's place and didn't notice anything was wrong, or if she did, she attributed it to my impending departure for college. She kept talking about how excited she was for me, how proud she was, how this was the beginning of a whole new chapter. And I smiled and nodded and felt like the worst person alive, because all I could think about was the way David's lips had felt against mine, the way his hand had trembled when he touched my face, the way my entire body had come alive in that moment. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was destructive and selfish and would hurt everyone involved. But knowing something and feeling it are two different things, and what I felt was a pull so strong it terrified me. The night before I left for college, my mom threw a small goodbye dinner. A few family friends came over, and everyone was cheerful and nostalgic, telling stories about me as a kid and offering advice about dorm life and making new friends. David was there, playing the role of supportive stepfather perfectly, smiling and laughing and clapping me on the shoulder in a way that felt performative and distant. I went through the motions, hugged people, thanked them for coming, and counted down the minutes until I could escape to my room. When the last guest finally left and my mom went upstairs to bed, I stayed in the kitchen cleaning up. I was washing dishes when I heard footsteps behind me, and I knew without turning around that it was him. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway. And when I finally looked over my shoulder, his expression was raw and unguarded in a way I'd never seen before. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I feel, it's not right. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's real." My hands stilled in the soapy water, my heart hammering in my chest. He took a step closer, and I could see the conflict written all over his face, the war between what he wanted and what he knew he should do. "I've tried to stop it," he continued. "I've tried to convince myself it's just, I don't know, some kind of confusion or midlife crisis or whatever. But it's not, and that terrifies me." I turned around slowly, wiping my hands on a towel, and looked at him directly. "So what are we going to do?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He let out a breath that sounded like a laugh and a sob at the same time. "Nothing," he said. "You're going to go to college tomorrow, and you're going to have an amazing life, and I'm going to stay here and be a good husband to your mother. That's what we're going to do." But even as he said it, I could see he didn't believe it. And neither did I. We stood there staring at each other, the space between us charged with everything we weren't saying. And then he closed the distance in 3 steps and kissed me again. This time it wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was desperate, hungry, like he'd been holding himself back for so long that the dam had finally broken. I kissed him back with the same intensity, my hands fisting in his shirt, and for those few moments, nothing else existed. Not my mother sleeping upstairs, not the fact that this was the worst possible thing we could be doing, not the future that was supposed to start tomorrow. There was only him and me, and the terrible, intoxicating rightness of being in his arms. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and his forehead was pressed against mine. "This is going to destroy everything," he whispered. I knew he was right, but I also knew that I didn't care. I left for college the next day, and for the first few weeks, I tried to convince myself that distance would fix everything. I threw myself into classes, made new friends, went to parties, did all the things a normal freshman was supposed to do. But every night, lying in my dorm room bed, I thought about David. I thought about the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd kissed me, the way his voice had cracked when he said it would destroy everything. And I knew that no amount of distance was going to make this go away. We texted occasionally, always careful, always vague. He'd ask how classes were going. I'd send him pictures of campus, And underneath every message was the weight of everything we weren't saying. My mom would call every few days, cheerful and chatty, telling me about her book club and the new restaurant she and David tried. And I'd listen with a knot in my stomach, hatting myself for what I was doing to her. It was October when I came home for fall break. I'd been gone for 6 weeks, and part of me hoped that seeing David again would break the spell, that I'd realize it had all been some strange, intense moment that didn't mean anything in the real world. But the second I walked through the door and saw him standing in the hallway, I knew nothing had changed. If anything, it had gotten worse. My mom hugged me tight, talking a mile a minute about all the things we were going to do that weekend. And over her shoulder, I saw David watching me with an expression that made my chest ache. That night, after my mom went to bed, I found him in his office. He was sitting at his desk staring at his computer screen, but I could tell he wasn't actually working. I closed the door behind me and he looked up, his face going pale. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but he didn't tell me to leave. I walked over to him slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "I can't stop thinking about you," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. He closed his eyes like my words physically hurt him. "I know," he said. "I can't either." And then he reached out and pulled me into his lap, and I went willingly, wrapping my arms around his neck as he buried his face in my hair. We sat like that for a long time, just holding each other, and it felt like coming home and falling apart at the same time. "We can't do this," he murmured against my shoulder. But his arms tightened around me, and I knew he was lying to both of us. That night was the first time we crossed the final line, the one that turned this from something that could maybe be explained away into something that couldn't. And afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness of his office, I felt a mixture of euphoria and devastation, so intense I thought I might be sick. The affair, because that's what it was even though I hated calling it that, continued for 8 months. 8 months of stolen moments and secret texts, and lying to my mother's face every single day. I'd come home for winter break, spring break, random weekends when I said I was homesick. But really, I just needed to see him. We developed a system, careful and calculated. He'd meet me at a hotel 20 minutes outside of town, or we'd find excuses to be alone in the house when my mom was at work or out with friends. Every time felt like the last time. Every time we'd say, "This has to stop. We can't keep doing this." And every time we'd end up in each other's arms again. The guilt was eating me alive, but the alternative, which was not having him at all, felt worse. I know how that sounds. I know how selfish and terrible that makes me. But I was 19 years old, and in love with someone I couldn't have. And logic doesn't mean much when your heart is involved. My mom started noticing things, small things at first. She'd comment on how distant David seemed, how he was working late more often, how he seemed distracted during conversations. I'd feel my stomach drop every time she said something, convinced this was it. This was the moment she'd figure it out. But she never did. Or maybe she did and chose not to believe it because the truth was too awful to confront. I watched her become a smaller, quieter version of herself, saw the confusion in her eyes when David would barely touch her, and I hated myself more than I've ever hated anything. But I still couldn't stop. That's the thing about affairs, especially ones like this. They don't feel like a choice after a certain point. They feel like an addiction, something you need even though it's destroying you. And David and I were destroying each other, slowly and thoroughly, and taking my mother down with us. It all came crashing down in May, right before the end of my freshman year. I'd come home for a weekend, told my mom I had a break between finals, and David and I had gotten careless. We were in his car, parked behind an old shopping center that had closed down years ago, and we were so wrapped up in each other that neither of us saw my mom's best friend drive past. She must have recognized David's car, must have seen enough through the window to understand what was happening. Because by the time I got home that evening, my mom was sitting at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand and tears streaming down her face. The look she gave me when I walked in will haunt me for the rest of my life. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was confusion, like she was looking at a stranger and trying to understand how that stranger had replaced her daughter. "Tell me it's not true," she said, her voice shaking. "Tell me Linda is lying, that she didn't see what she thinks she saw." I opened my mouth to deny it, to come up with some explanation, but nothing came out. I just stood there frozen while David walked in behind me, and the moment my mom saw his face, saw the guilt written all over it, she knew. She let out a sound I'll never forget, something between a scream and a sob, and she threw her phone across the room. It shattered against the wall, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell we were all under. "How long?" she asked, her voice deadly quiet now. Neither of us answered. "How long?" she screamed, and I flinched. 8 months, David said quietly, and my mom's face crumpled. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the exact moment she stopped seeing me as her daughter and started seeing me as the person who'd betrayed her in the worst possible way. "Get out," she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless, and somehow that was worse than the screaming. "Both of you, get out of my house." I tried to apologize, tried to explain, even though there was no explanation that would make this okay. But she wouldn't look at me. David stepped forward, tried to say something, and she picked up a glass from the table and threw it at him. It missed, hit the wall behind his head, and shattered into 1,000 pieces. "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police," she said. "I don't care what happens to either of you, just get out." So we left. I grabbed my bag from my room, and we walked out of that house together, and I knew in my bones that I would never be welcome there again. David drove us to a hotel, the same one we'd been to a dozen times before, but this time it felt different. This time there was no thrill, no excitement, just a crushing sense of loss and the dawning realization of what we'd done. We sat on the edge of the bed in silence for what felt like hours, and then David put his head in his hands and started crying. I'd never seen him cry before. It was horrible and raw and human, and I didn't know what to do. "I've destroyed everything," he said through his tears. "My marriage, your relationship with your mother, your life. What have I done?" And I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't just his fault, that I'd made choices too, but the words felt hollow. Because the truth was, he was right. We had destroyed everything. In the weeks that followed, my mom filed for divorce. She told everyone, her friends, our family, what had happened, and I became a pariah overnight. My aunt, who I'd always been close with, sent me an email calling me a homewrecker and saying she never wanted to see me again. My grandmother, my dad's mom, who'd always taken my side when my dad left, told me I was disgusting and that I'd broken my mother's heart. The few family members who didn't completely cut me off treated me with a mixture of pity and disgust that was almost worse. My mom refused to speak to me, blocked my number, blocked me on every social media platform. I'd lost her completely. David and I stayed together for 3 months after everything fell apart. We got an apartment together, tried to build some kind of life out of the wreckage, but it was doomed from the start. Every time I looked at him, I saw what we'd done. Every time he looked at me, I could see the guilt eating him alive. The relationship that had felt so intense, so necessary, crumbled without the secrecy holding it together. We fought constantly about everything and nothing. He'd drink too much and cry about losing my mom, and I'd shut down emotionally because I didn't know how to process what we'd become. One night, after a particularly bad fight, he said, "I don't know if I ever really loved you, or if I just loved the idea of you." And that broke something in me that I don't think will ever fully heal, because I'd given up everything for him. My mother, my family, my sense of self, and he wasn't even sure it had been real. We broke up 2 weeks later. He moved back to the city where he'd lived before meeting my mom, and I dropped out of college and moved in with a friend from high school who was kind enough not to judge me too harshly. I got a job waitressing, tried to figure out who I was outside of the chaos I'd created. My mom eventually agreed to meet me for coffee, 6 months after everything exploded, and it was the hardest hour of my life. She looked older, tired, and when she looked at me, there was nothing in her eyes. No love, no anger, just emptiness. She told me she was trying to forgive me, that her therapist said holding on to anger would only hurt her, but that she didn't know if we'd ever have a real relationship again. She said she needed time, maybe years, maybe forever. And then she left, and I sat in that coffee shop crying until the barista asked if I was okay. It's been 2 years now. I'm 21, working 2 jobs, slowly taking online classes to finish my degree. I haven't spoken to David since the day we broke up. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he moved to another state, that he's in therapy, that he's trying to rebuild his life. My mom and I text occasionally, brief and surface-level messages about holidays or birthdays, but we haven't seen each other in person since that coffee shop meeting. I don't know if we ever will. I've had to build a completely new life, make new friends who don't know my history, create a version of myself that isn't defined by the worst thing I've ever done. Some days are okay. Some days I can go hours without thinking about what happened. But most days, I carry the weight of it with me, this heavy, suffocating guilt that never fully goes away. People ask me sometimes, the few people who know the whole story, if I regret it. And the honest answer is I don't know. I regret hurting my mother. I regret the way it ended, the way we destroyed each other and everyone around us. But do I regret loving him? Do I regret those stolen moments when I felt more alive than I'd ever felt before or since? I don't know if I can regret something that felt so real, even if it was wrong. Maybe that makes me a bad person. Maybe I still don't fully understand the gravity of what I did. Or maybe I understand it perfectly, and I'm just learning to live with the fact that people are complicated and messy and capable of loving in ways that hurt everyone involved. I don't have any wisdom to offer. I don't have a moral to this story. All I know is that love, real love, doesn't always look the way we want it to. Sometimes it's beautiful, and sometimes it's destructive, and sometimes it's both at the same time. And you have to live with the choices you make, even when those choices break you.